I was 14 years old, and it was an average night around 9 p.m. I was babysitting my little cousin at his house while my mom and aunt were out shopping. My dad and uncle were at the movie theater. My cousin, who was about 7 at the time, was playing with his toys in the living room while I was half watching TV. It was the first time I was at home alone at night with a kid, and I felt uneasy. It was a strange sensation that I couldn't quite identify, and it made me anxious. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just nerves from being responsible for a young child. After a while, I decided to get up and walk to the back door to check the locks. I wanted to ensure everything was secure since it was dark outside. After confirming that the door was locked, I walked back through the kitchen. That's when I saw what was causing my unease. In the window, there was a man, disheveled and unkempt, with unshaven facial hair and clothes that looked old and torn. He was just standing there, staring in at my cousin. My heart raced as a sense of protectiveness kicked in. I pretended like I hadn't seen him and turned back to my cousin, trying to keep my voice calm. "Hey buddy, let's go upstairs. Our parents will be home soon, and they don't want you staying up too late." I led him up the stairs and tucked him into bed, all while knowing there was a man outside watching us. At the time, I was about 125 pounds and 5'8", and I played football at school. I felt like I could handle myself if it came down to it. After putting my cousin to bed, I headed downstairs with a sense of urgency. I walked into the kitchen and grabbed a meat tenderizer, a heavy hammer-like tool I hoped would serve as a weapon if needed. As I turned back to the window, my heart sank. He was gone. I sprinted to the front door and checked the locks. Both the deadbolt and the knob were secure. I felt a slight wave of relief, but it was short-lived. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still nearby. I ran back upstairs and went into my cousin's room, shutting the door behind me. I sat down in front of it, blocking it with my body. My cousin, seeing my serious expression, asked, "What are you doing?" I told him not to worry and that he should keep his head low and stay quiet. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, and I explained the situation, my voice shaking. They assured me that officers would be dispatched immediately. However, they informed me it would take about 30 minutes for them to arrive. After that, I called my dad and uncle, but I knew they were at least 45 minutes away. I hung up and sat in silence, gripping the meat tenderizer tightly. I didn't want to scare my cousin, but I felt a deep fear creeping in. Then I heard it. A loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. My heart dropped as I realized the man had broken a window. I could hear heavy boots walking around on the main floor. I leaned closer to my cousin and whispered, "Stay calm, hide under the covers, and keep quiet." I could hear the man moving around downstairs, and it was horrifying. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified in the stillness of the house. I couldn't believe this was happening. I was responsible for my cousin, and I felt completely powerless. I glanced at the clock. About 5 minutes passed since I had heard the glass shatter, and the footsteps continued moving around the house. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. At that moment, I was terrified. My cousin's bedroom door was no more than 10 feet from the stairs. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and I held my breath, gripping the meat tenderizer tightly, ready to defend us. I heard the man start to open the doors in the hallway. First my aunt and uncle's room, then the bathroom. My mind raced as I thought about what I would do if he opened the door to my cousin's room. I felt completely exposed, sitting there with nothing but a kitchen tool to protect us. After 15 minutes of hearing the man moving around, I finally heard him go back downstairs. I listened intently as he opened the door to the basement. I couldn't believe it. I was in a state of shock and fear. It felt like forever before I heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. Finally, 15 minutes later, the police arrived, bursting into the house with flashlights and drawn weapons. They shouted for anyone inside to come out, but I stayed silent, still clutching the meat tenderizer. I could hear them moving through the house, checking each room thoroughly. Eventually, they found me and my cousin huddled together in his room. The officers quickly reassured us that everything was fine now. They explained that the man who had broken into the house had escaped from a mental hospital located 1 province away. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, feeling both relief and disbelief wash over me. The officers continued to check the house for any signs of the man, while one of them comforted us. They assured us that they had a few patrols out looking for him, and that we would be safe. My dad and uncle arrived shortly after, looking frantic. I could see the worry in their eyes as they rushed to us. I explained everything that had happened, and they listened carefully, looking relieved but still concerned. The officers filled them in on the situation, assuring them that the man was being apprehended. I felt a sense of safety return as I realized I was no longer alone. I would never forget that night or the fear I felt while protecting my cousin. It was a terrifying experience that taught me the importance of being vigilant, especially when you are home alone at night. Before we move on to the next story, if you're still here, make sure to subscribe and let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments for more true stories. Thanks. The night before Valentine's Day in 2023 turned out to be one of the most harrowing nights of my life, and it had nothing to do with ghosts or supernatural forces. It was a chilling experience rooted in tragic reality. My parents had decided to take their first vacation alone since my brother and I were born, leaving me to dog sit our family German Shepherd in our home. They planned to be away for 8 days, and for the first few nights, everything went smoothly. But on the third night after their departure, everything changed. I had set up camp on the living room couch, as my old bedroom had been converted into a home office for my dad's remote work. My loyal dog, Duke, a massive German Shepherd with a gentle demeanor, lay peacefully at my feet, offering some comfort in the stillness of the night. As the clock struck a little past 3 a.m., I drifted into a deep sleep, completely unaware of the chaos brewing outside. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by a deafening noise, a loud bang that echoed through the house. Duke sprang up, barking uncontrollably, his deep growls piercing the silence. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of the disruption. Was it thunder? A car backfiring? Fear gripped me, but my instinct was to calm Duke. I started to sit up on the couch, ready to reassure him that everything was all right. But just as I was about to speak, a woman's terrified scream pierced the night. No, please no. The raw panic in her voice sent chills down my spine. Before I could react, another bang erupted, sharper and more intense than the first. Wood splinters rained down onto my face, landing in my eye as the wall behind me trembled. The realization hit me hard. Something horrific had just unfolded. In that fleeting moment, I understood the gravity of the situation. My neighbor had shot his daughter. Those splinters, they were fragments of the wall, splintered from the force of the bullet or her body hitting it. If I had sat up as I intended, I would have been inches away from potential danger. With a surge of adrenaline, I dialed 911, my fingers trembling as I pressed the numbers. The operator's calm voice helped ground me as I struggled to convey the chaos unfolding next door. After ensuring that all doors and windows were locked, I sat in silence, straining to hear what would happen next. A few minutes later, the unmistakable wail of police sirens filled the air, followed by the sounds of officers shouting commands and kicking down my neighbor's door. My heart raced as I watched from my window, anxiety coursing through me as they apprehended him and took him into custody. After what felt like an eternity, I finally ventured outside to speak with the officers still present. I recounted everything I had heard, my voice shaky but determined. I described the screams, the gunshots, and the splinters that had fallen from the wall, knowing how close I had come to something far worse. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn into a whirlwind of legal proceedings. I received a subpoena to testify against my neighbor, who claimed the shooting was an accident. But I knew the truth. I had heard that desperate scream before the second shot rang out, and there was no doubt in my mind that it wasn't a mistake. The thought of facing him in court filled me with dread. He lived right next door, and if he were acquitted, I knew he wouldn't hesitate to seek revenge. When the day of the trial arrived, I sat in the courtroom, the air thick with tension. I was nervous, but I understood the importance of my testimony. When it was my turn to take the stand, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. I steadied myself and spoke clearly, detailing the events of that night. I was determined to convey the horror I had witnessed, the reality of what had transpired just beyond the walls of my home. Thankfully, the district attorney was committed to ensuring justice was served. After several tense days in court, the verdict was delivered. My neighbor was found guilty of murder and sentenced to over 20 years in prison without the possibility of parole. A wave of relief flooded over me. The nightmare was finally over, and he would no longer pose a threat to anyone. Years later, the memory of that fateful night still lingers in my mind. I often think about how close I came to an entirely different outcome. My neighbor, now in his 70s, serves his sentence far away, while I have moved on with my life. Yet I'll never forget the sound of that scream or the splinters that fell into my eye. It was a night that altered everything. It was the middle of summer, and my parents had left for the weekend to go to our house in Cape Cod. It's about a 2-hour drive away, so it's no big deal for them to leave me alone for a few days. My mom had made some pasta for me to heat up to eat whenever, and I had some money if I wanted to order a pizza. Things were all good. The first night I was alone, I stayed up till 3 in the morning playing Xbox, so I woke up really late the next day. I checked my phone when I woke up and saw it was a little past 1. I had made plans to play some street hockey with my friends at 3, so I threw myself out of bed and stumbled into the shower. I take really long showers, so when my parents are gone, I go mental. I was in there for about 45 minutes, scrolling through Reddit and Twitter when I heard my front door open. The bathroom is directly up the stairs from the back door, and that thing is pretty loud when it opens and closes. I immediately froze since, obviously, I was supposed to be alone. I waited for about 2 minutes, ears trained to hear anything else. Nothing. I figured it was just the wind or maybe my parents had come home early, so I turned off the shower, wrapped a towel around myself, and slowly made my way down the stairs to check it out. The stairs leading to the kitchen, where the back door is, are narrow and walled in, making it feel like I was walking down a tighter version of a stairwell. This meant I couldn't see into the kitchen until I reached the bottom. Even though my house is old and the creaking stairs announced my every step, I took my time, trying to be as quiet as possible. It probably took me about 45 seconds to walk down all 12 stairs. When I reached the second to last step, just before I could see into the kitchen, I paused for a moment to gather my thoughts. Deep down, I knew I was being silly. There was no reason to think anything was in the kitchen. I hadn't heard any other noises, and if there had been burglars, they wouldn't have still been lingering in the kitchen. After mentally scolding myself for being such a wuss, I let out a nervous chuckle and confidently walked down the last 2 steps, turning the corner into the kitchen. Standing about 2 feet away from me in the middle of my kitchen is a man staring straight at me, perfectly still, with a massive smile across his face, just staring at me. The thing I remember most vividly wasn't his face or his smile, but his arms. They weren't just at his side. He held them in the strangest, most abnormal position I've ever seen. He had rotated them to the point where they were almost completely reversed, lifting them up and a little behind himself. I don't know why I remember this so much, but it was just the most demonic, abnormal position I'd ever encountered. Honest to God, I think I almost had a heart attack right there. Looking back, I can realize how creepy this situation was, but in the moment, I just took a step towards him and punched him as hard as I could in the jaw, sort of half slapping and pushing him towards the ground. The second I connected, I beelined up the stairs, dropping my towel in the kitchen, my heart racing out of control. I sprinted into my room and locked the door behind me. Without even thinking, I immediately called 911 and, nearly in tears, told the operator what happened. As I sat on the floor of my room, practically in the fetal position, staring at the door and praying that a cop would arrive soon, I noticed the light coming from the gap under my door had stopped. The fucker was standing outside my door. There are no words to describe the feeling I had. I was paralyzed with fear. watching the shadow across the bottom of the door shift in tiny ways. I stayed balled up, staring at the gap, praying the man would go away for what felt like an hour. All the while, the 911 operator was asking, "Hello? Sir, are you there? Hello?" I didn't want to make a noise, and even if I wanted to move my arms to bring the phone to my mouth, I don't think I could have. Eventually, the light returned to the gap, and I heard the faintest of footsteps slowly creaking the wooden floorboards as he walked down the hall. It was silent for minutes as I just sat there curled up, unable to even speak. I heard banging on the front door and the sound of two officers entering my house. I finally felt safe and opened the door to see the two of them standing there. I almost cried. Nowadays, my parents don't leave me home alone anymore, thank God, and I check every lock on the house before going to bed. I still get nightmares occasionally, and my heart starts racing whenever I see someone standing still. But I'm doing all right. Even working with sketch artists and a few lineups, the police never found whoever the hell was in my house. That sends shivers down my spine every time I look outside, half expecting to see him standing across the street, smiling under a lamppost. I have no idea what he wanted or who he was. This incident happened to me last year on Halloween. My little brother and I were home alone because our parents had gone out to a Halloween party. They tasked us with handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters, which bummed my brother and me out since we had made plans to go trick-or-treating with a few friends. Our parents told us we were too old for trick-or-treating and suggested we invite our friends over instead. My friends declined my invitation, eager to collect candy themselves. So I was left home alone with my brother, handing out candy to strangers. As the evening wore on, a lot of people stopped by our house. By 10 p.m., almost all the candy was gone, and my brother and I decided we'd eat the last few pieces. We settled on the couch, watching a scary movie and stuffing our faces with candy, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. I stormed off the couch, wondering who could be knocking at our door this late. I assumed it was just some late-night trick-or-treaters. Even if that were the case, I had turned off the porch light and Halloween decorations, which should have been a dead giveaway that we were out of candy. Maybe it was just my parents coming home early. Being cautious, I looked through the peephole. To my surprise, I saw a suspicious man standing on our front porch. He wore a black hoodie with the hood pulled over his head, obscuring his face. The only detail I could spot was a beard and dry, crusty lips. There was no way this guy was a trick-or-treater. He wasn't wearing a costume and was far too old to be out begging for candy. His hands were stuffed in the front pocket of his hoodie, and he looked incredibly thin. Every single red flag went off in my head about this guy. There was no way I was opening the door. Still peering through the peephole, I watched as he knocked on the door again. He seemed desperate for us to open it and was shaking a bit. It wasn't cold outside, definitely not cold enough for someone to be trembling. I felt a chill run down my spine as he gave me a bad vibe, and I wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. "We're out of candy," I shouted through the door, trying to sound firm. I watched as a smile spread across his face. It wasn't friendly. It was menacing. "Are you alone in there?" the man asked, his voice raspy and dry. "Should I call the police?" my little brother asked quietly, gripping his cell phone tightly. His fear was palpable, and it sent a shiver through me. The man let out a low, grumbling laugh. "Sounds like you're not alone in there." I continued to watch him through the peephole, my heart racing. His hands remained wedged tightly in his pockets, and he was still shaking slightly. I wondered if he was armed. I decided to take action and spoke to him in the most intimidating voice I could muster. "Get the hell away from my house, or I'll call the police," I shouted, hoping to scare him off. His smile faded, replaced by a look of fury. His teeth were piss yellow, and I concluded he was likely some homeless crackhead. Fortunately, he backed off without trying to break in, probably realizing I wasn't messing around. I didn't stop watching him through the peephole until he was completely off our property. My brother and I breathed a sigh of relief, but were still on edge. We decided not to call the police, feeling it wasn't necessary since the man hadn't harmed us. We returned to the couch, trying to distract ourselves with the movie until our parents came home. A short while later, as we settled back in, I felt a strange urge to check the window. I moved cautiously towards the curtain and peeked through. My heart stopped as I caught sight of him again, the man in the black hoodie. This time, he was no longer standing at the door. Instead, he was crouched low, peeking through our window. My breath hitched in my throat. His eyes were wild, darting around as if he was looking for something or someone. I quickly backed away from the window, my heart racing. "What's wrong?" my brother asked, his voice trembling. "He's at the window," I whispered urgently, pointing toward the living room. My brother's eyes widened in fear. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling in my stomach as I considered our situation. The man had already tried to get in through the front door, and now he was at the window. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. "There's a man outside our house. He's been lurking around, and I think he might be dangerous," I whispered urgently to the operator. As I spoke, I glanced back at the window. The man had stood up slightly, still peering through, and I could see the desperation in his eyes, a mix of anger and hunger that sent chills down my spine. "I need you to stay inside and lock all your doors," the operator instructed, her voice calm yet firm. "Police are on their way. Can you describe the man?" I gave her the details I could remember, all while my brother gripped my arm tightly, fear written across his face. After what felt like an eternity, the police arrived, their lights flashing. They quickly surrounded the house, and I breathed a sigh of relief. The man, realizing the situation was turning against him, darted off into the night, disappearing into the shadows. The officers questioned us about the incident and took our statements. They promised to increase patrols in our area and search for the man who had escaped from a nearby asylum, about 5 miles away. It sent chills down my spine to think he was so close to us, and even more horrifying to realize he had been lurking right outside our home. The next day, my brother and I woke up to a terrifying news report. An elderly woman who lived just a few houses down from us had been brutally injured during an attack. Her neighbor discovered her lying on her front porch, bleeding and barely conscious. My brother and I immediately knew who had done it and told the police what we knew. They couldn't do much from our vague descriptions since we hadn't seen many details of his face. They assured us they would investigate, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They went on the hunt for the man, but he eluded them. As the reality of what happened sank in, the knowledge that he had been lurking outside our window, peeking in, intensified my guilt. I still blame myself for the elderly woman's injury. If I had called the police on Halloween, perhaps they could have caught him before he ever made it to her house. It's terrifying to think that someone like him, a man who only had the urge to hurt, was so close. He hadn't taken anything from the elderly woman's house. He only wanted to inflict pain. That thought lingers in my mind, a constant reminder of how close we came to a tragedy that could have been prevented. It was Halloween night in 2015, and what happened that evening would become the scariest incident of my life. Nate, my best friend, bailed at the last minute, so I was left wandering the streets alone, dressed as a zombie and collecting candy from houses that didn't care. Most kids my age were at parties or causing trouble, but here I was, walking around for free candy like a little kid. It felt awkward, but I wasn't ready to go home yet. There was one street I hadn't been down. It was at the edge of town, near the woods, where the houses were spread out and barely anyone lived anymore. People said the area was creepy, but I wasn't superstitious. It was just houses, old, run down, and forgotten. I stood at the corner, looking down the street. The sky was a bit orange from the last light of the day, and the whole place felt off, but I figured, what's the worst that could happen? I could hit a couple more houses and call it a night. I walked down the street, passing dark houses with overgrown yards. No lights, no decorations, not even a porch pumpkin. These weren't the kind of houses people invited trick-or-treaters to. Still, I went up to the first one, an old Victorian place with its windows boarded up. I knocked once, half expecting it to fall in from the sound. Nothing. I shrugged and turned to leave, but then I heard it. Footsteps. slow and deliberate, somewhere behind me. I stopped dead, my heart pounding. I looked over my shoulder. The street was empty. I waited for a second, listening, but there was only silence. I shook my head, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was late, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I kept walking, a little faster now, eager to get back to the busier streets. But after a few steps I heard it again, footsteps, steady, keeping pace with mine. I stopped again. This time, I didn't turn around right away. I just stood there, staring ahead, listening. The footsteps stopped too. Slowly, I turned my head and glanced back. There was a man standing in the middle of the road. He wasn't far, maybe 30 feet behind me. He looked normal enough at first glance, just an average guy, but something about the way he stood made my skin crawl. He didn't move. Didn't say anything. He just stared at me. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to ask if he needed something, but the way he just stood there, silent, made my throat tighten. Instead, I started walking again, faster now, my heart thudding harder with each step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and each time he was closer. Not running, but always closer, like he was measuring his steps, waiting for something. By the time I hit the end of the street, I was almost jogging, trying to keep calm but failing. I cut through the park, hoping to lose him, but when I looked back, he was still there, closer now. No matter how fast I went, his pace never changed. It was like he knew exactly how fast to walk to keep me in his sights. I started to panic. My legs felt weak, and my mouth was dry. I could hear him now, the sound of his boots hitting the pavement, slow and steady, getting louder. I broke into a full run, sprinting through the trees, branches whipping at my face. My breath came in short gasps, and every time I looked back, he was closer, always the same slow walk, like he didn't have to rush, like he had all the time in the world. I tripped, hitting the ground hard, dirt and leaves scraping my hands and knees. I scrambled to get up, but before I could, I felt a hand wrap around my ankle, cold and rough, dragging me back. I kicked hard, connecting with something solid, and for a second, his grip loosened. I pushed myself up, running again, but I could hear him, closer now, his breathing heavy. I made it to the street, thinking if I could just get somewhere with lights, somewhere with people, I'd be safe. But the street was empty. No cars, no people, just darkness. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. I knew if I did, he'd catch me. I rounded a corner, my heart racing, and that's when I felt it, a hard shove from behind. I went down, hitting the ground hard, my face scraping the pavement. Before I could even try to get up, he was on me, his knee pressing into my back, his hands gripping my arms, pinning me down. I struggled, trying to twist away, but he was strong, too strong. I tried to scream, but his hand clamped over my mouth, smothering the sound. I could feel his breath on the back of my neck, heavy and ragged. And then he spoke, his voice low and calm, like this was just another day to him. "Quiet," he said, his grip tightening. "No one's coming." I didn't have a chance to fight. His hand was on my throat, squeezing, and all I could do was gasp, my vision blurring, my chest heaving as I struggled to breathe. My arms went limp, and the last thing I heard before everything went dark was his voice, soft and almost mocking. "Trick or treat." I woke up on the cold ground, my body aching. My throat burned, and I felt lost. Then I remembered everything, the man chasing me, the grip around my neck. I tried to move but felt weak. My legs felt heavy, and I couldn't stand up because my ankle was twisted from tripping while running. I lay there listening to the silence. Hours passed, and the sky slowly began to lighten. Just when I thought I might be alone, I heard voices nearby. "Over here," someone shouted. I wanted to call out, but my voice wouldn't come. I saw flashlights moving through the trees, and my heart lifted. A group of people found me and rushed over. "We found him," one said. Hands lifted me carefully, and a blanket wrapped around me. "Stay with us," the paramedic said. "You're safe now." As they wheeled me to an ambulance, the sirens blared, and I felt relief wash over me. Later, I learned that the police had caught the man. He was a local who had been missing for years and turned out to be a psycho who had been stalking the area. I was shaken but grateful. I had escaped, and he would never hurt anyone again. I wasn't much of a Halloween person growing up. My parents were pretty religious, so I never did the whole trick-or-treating thing, never dressed up. Halloween was just another night. But Sarah, my girlfriend, was obsessed with it. She loved everything about it. The costumes, the parties, the decorations. She'd start planning weeks in advance, and it became a big deal for us every year. And because I love her, I went along with it, even though Halloween parties weren't really my scene. This year, though, we were going to Jake's party. Jake wasn't exactly a friend, more of an acquaintance, one of those guys you can never really trust. He was always a little too friendly, always looking for attention, throwing massive parties just to prove he was the cool guy. I wasn't excited to go, but Sarah had convinced me. She'd even picked out matching costumes. Vampire for me, witch for her. So I caved, figuring it would be like every other party. Loud, messy, but harmless. We showed up around 9 p.m., and the place was already packed. Jake had really gone overboard with the decorations this year. The front yard was filled with fake tombstones, plastic skeletons hanging from the trees, and eerie red lights glowing from the windows. Inside, it was even worse. There were fake spiderwebs everywhere, thick fog from a machine creeping along the floor, and loud music pounding through the walls. It felt more like a haunted house than a party. Jake, in his usual obnoxious way, greeted us at the door, already drunk. He was dressed as a zombie, his face caked in makeup, and his breath reeked of alcohol. He handed us drinks right away, a red punch he'd been bragging about all night. Sarah took a sip, laughing at how sweet and strong it was. I hesitated but took a drink too, trying to relax and enjoy the night. An hour passed, and that's when I started to notice things were off. At first, it was subtle. People were laughing too loud, too long. Faces that had been familiar earlier in the night now seemed distant, their expressions vacant, like they weren't fully present. Conversations drifted off mid-sentence. A few people were just standing in corners, staring at nothing. I figured everyone was just drunk or high. Jake's parties were always wild, and there was no telling what people were on. But then I saw this guy. He was in the corner of the living room, dressed as some cheap zombie, but there was something seriously wrong with him. He was leaning against the wall, his head drooping, and his hand was dripping blood. At first, I thought it was part of his costume, but when I got closer, I realized it wasn't. Blood was running down his arm, pooling on the floor. No one seemed to notice. I walked over to him, trying to stay calm. "Hey man, you okay?" He didn't respond. His head lolled to the side, and his eyes were half closed, unfocused. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but he jerked back, his whole body shaking. His skin was clammy, pale, and for a moment I thought he was going to collapse. "Hey!" I yelled, louder now. But still, no one paid attention. Everyone else was wrapped up in their own world, laughing, dancing, oblivious to what was happening around them. That's when I started to feel weird, too. The air in the house felt heavy, thick, like it was pressing down on me. My head began to spin, and my vision blurred. The lights seemed too dim, and the music, so loud just a moment ago, sounded distant, like it was underwater. I felt like I was moving in slow motion. My thoughts jumbled, disconnected. I tried to shake it off, but something was definitely wrong. I looked around for Sarah, panic starting to creep in. I found her sitting on the couch, staring blankly ahead. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her face pale. She wasn't talking to anyone, just sitting there, motionless. I rushed over to her, grabbing her hand. "Sarah, you okay?" She didn't respond at first. Then she slowly turned her head toward me, but it was like she didn't even see me. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I shook her gently, trying to snap her out of it. "Sarah, come on, we need to go." Finally, she blinked, and her eyes focused on me. She looked terrified, but not in a way I'd ever seen before. It wasn't fear from being scared. It was something deeper, something more primal. "I don't feel good," she whispered. Her voice was shaky, weak. I think there's something in the punch." I felt my stomach drop. I'd only had a few sips, but now it made sense. Whatever was happening to everyone, it was the punch. I looked around the room again, and that's when I really saw what was going on. People weren't just drunk. They were sick. Some were slumped over, unconscious. Others were vomiting, their bodies racked with violent spasms. One guy was crawling across the floor, his fingers clawing at the carpet as if he was trying to get away from something. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were bloodshot, rolling back in his head. The air smelled wrong now, metallic, like blood and bile. The music had stopped, but the room was filled with this low, buzzing noise, like a swarm of insects or a broken speaker. I could hear people moaning, crying, some of them gasping for breath. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the door. We stumbled through the crowd, stepping over people who were barely conscious, their bodies twitching and jerking like they were being electrocuted. When we finally made it outside, the cold air hit us like a slap in the face. Sarah collapsed onto the grass, her breathing shallow. I knelt beside her, trying to stay calm, but inside I was freaking out. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The line was busy. I tried again, still busy. I looked around, and that's when I saw the others. People were scattered across the yard, lying on the ground, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways. Some were foaming at the mouth, others were completely still. I heard distant screams coming from inside the house. The front door was wide open, but I couldn't see anyone coming out. Sarah's breathing was getting worse. Her skin was clammy, her eyes fluttering. "We need help," she whispered, barely able to speak. I tried to carry her, but I was too weak. My own body felt heavy, like I was sinking into the ground. That's when I saw a figure standing in the doorway of the house, silhouetted by the eerie red lights from inside. It was Jake, still dressed as a zombie, but he wasn't his usual cocky self. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around, wild and terrified. He stumbled toward us, pulling out his phone with shaky hands. I called the ambulance," he stammered, his voice cracking. I didn't know this was going to happen. I thought it was just a party." I glared at him, barely able to muster the energy to speak. "What did you put in the punch, Jake?" He shook his head frantically. "I swear, man, it wasn't me. I didn't spike anything. Someone else must have." I didn't know. I didn't trust him. I never had. But right then, it didn't matter. What mattered was that help was finally on the way. Jake stood there, trembling, his face streaked with sweat. "I just wanted people to have a good time," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Then he backed away, disappearing into the chaos as the paramedics arrived. They took Sarah away in a stretcher, her eyes closed, her chest barely rising. I sat there, watching as they carried out more people, some still twitching, others covered with sheets. Whatever had been in the punch, it wasn't just a drug. It was something else. Something that turned that party into a nightmare. Some people didn't make it. Others were left with permanent damage. Sarah and I survived, but that night has never left me. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. Blank, lifeless, twitching in the darkness. And I hear that buzzing like insects crawling inside my brain. I haven't been to a Halloween party since. I had just moved to Jackson, Ohio from Miami, Florida, because I had just gotten out of an extremely physically, emotionally, and mentally abusive relationship that lasted 3 years. Around June, my current boyfriend and I had been going on trips pretty much every weekend. We would visit a new hiking and waterfall area. Although there isn't a nightlife, Tennessee is amazingly beautiful. We went to this place called Narrows of the Harpeth. This was one of the underwhelming places we've been to, but it was still relaxing. After we found a cool place to sit and swim after hiking for 2 hours, a few shots and one blunt later, it was time to make our trip back to Jackson. I put my shoes on and slipped my dress back on, which is a little above knee length. Like, if I bend too far forward, my little bum would be on display. I own my body and sexuality, so showing some skin never really bothers me, and I don't think about it because I just expect people to respect me as I respect them and the way they dress. Anyways, on the way back to the car, I, being the tipsy dumbass I am, managed to trip and fall and scrape my leg pretty badly. It's actually scarred now. I told my boyfriend we needed to go to Walmart once we got back to Jackson so I could thoroughly clean my wound with hydrogen peroxide and Neosporin. My boyfriend said, okay. An hour later, we were at Walmart. Mind you, it was only about 9 p.m., going on 10 p.m., not late by any means. We got what I needed, but because I was still tipsy and pretty high from the blunt I finished in the car ride home, I got distracted so easily. I remembered that my boyfriend got me the wrong size case for my iPhone 11 Pro. He got the Max instead of just the Pro. I wanted an idea of what I could trade it for, and he wanted to look at some of the games as well as a gaming PC for me. So I was happily tipsy and excited to find a new case, which, if you have ever been to Walmart, the cases are never in order and often cause you to bend down to look at things. There was a man looking at the cases, and I just said, "Excuse me, sorry, can I look at those cases you're standing in front of?" He just looked at me with a blank yet dirty look, nodded, and stepped over. About 5 minutes in, this lady, along with what I assumed were her 2 children, approached me. Mind you, we were in the middle of a pandemic, and I was thrown off by how close she was to me, especially with her baby that looked no older than 9 months. I stepped back, and she just grabbed my arm and said, "OMG, wow, I haven't seen you in forever. Look at that hair, wow." Her grip tightened. At this point, my heart was racing, my face got so hot, and I was visibly scared. That's when my boyfriend said, "Everything okay, babe?" He looked at me equally concerned. I was thinking to myself, does this lady know my mom? Who is she? Is she an old family friend? I don't remember. Mind you, I'm originally from Ohio. We have family here, but I don't know any of my family that lives in Tennessee. Also, my mom loves to brag about her kids, so I'm trying to shake this weird feeling, but her daughter keeps looking behind me. So I go to turn around and she goes, "No, don't turn around. Walk with me, please. Trust me." I don't know why, but I felt she was being genuine, and I just followed her. We stepped over to the side by the baby clothes, which was still in front of the electronics, and she said, "Baby, I am so sorry to scare you, but there are 3 men surrounding you. They went by the laptops, talked, and then I noticed the guy taking photos and videos of you while you were bent over looking at the cases. The other man was the tall guy next to you, and I don't know where the 3rd man went. All I can remember is this high-pitched ringing in my ears. My stomach flipped, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I never knew what people meant when they say, everything slowed down. But in that moment, everything moved in slow motion, and I was freaked out to the point that I have no clue what she said after. It was as if I blacked out for a moment and then quickly realized that the family and my boyfriend were looking at me, visibly panicked. I turned around, and there he was. He was Hispanic, shorter than me, maybe about 5'1", but he was very much built and looked to be about 40. The other man, who was white, was maybe in his 40s and about 5'11". I'll never forget the dead. Blank rage in that Hispanic man's eyes, like his first meal in 5 days had been stolen from him, and he was ready to kill in order to have it back. That's when I saw the white man walk over to him. They said something, both looked at me, looked back at each other, said something else, and started to walk slowly towards us. At that point, we all turned and headed for the registers. And that's when I thanked my lucky stars, because there were about 3 cops at the front of the store. By the time I rudely pushed past people to get to self-checkout, with tears in my eyes and frantically repeating, "Excuse me," to anyone who got in front of me, I looked back and saw them just standing there, but with the 3rd guy this time. My heart sank, and I wanted to pass out at that moment. I guess it looked like I was going up to the cops, because they hightailed it once they saw me get close to the cops. Being high as shit and being a black woman, I wasn't going to chance the cops turning this around on me because I was simply stoned and tipsy. My only thought was, get to the car, get to the gun, don't stop, run. My boyfriend said he could barely keep up with me, and at one point, I had grabbed his hand so tight he had to force the grip off because it felt like I was going to crush his hands. Before anyone bashes my boyfriend, I don't expect a man to be my savior. Also, he isn't the angry, confrontational type. He is very calm and level-headed. He wouldn't even hurt a fly unless I asked him to get rid of it for whatever reason. I just knew I was the target, and I was putting him at risk. I knew they could easily jump him, and one of them could overpower me after taking him out. I probably looked crazed, half walking and running past everyone, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to become another missing sister. We made it to the car safely and peeled out of there. I've never seen him drive so fast, as he is beyond careful and would never speed. We sat at a Sonic for about an hour to make sure we weren't being followed. We recounted everything that happened. I just couldn't believe we both were too tipsy to notice that I had become prey in somewhere as simple as a Walmart. I've never felt so stupid and irresponsible in my life. I never want to experience that fear and panic in my life again. I didn't even get the chance to thank the lady who pretty much saved us. Sometimes we talk about it. What if the lady didn't see what that guy was doing? Even if we had caught on, there were 3 men, and we only saw 2 at first. I think of the horrors. That night, I had a nightmare that the men attacked us in the parking lot. The creepiest part of the dream was that the 3rd man shoved me in the trunk, and as I went to look at his face, all I could see was a featureless face. I woke up in tears that night, realizing I didn't get a clear look at the 3rd guy's face. It took me nearly a month to enter a Walmart again. I am a 19-year-old female, and I started working at Walmart a few months ago after moving to Seattle, Washington from Los Angeles, California. I needed a job to support myself, and the flexible hours suited my schedule. I enjoyed the quiet late-night shifts where I could stock shelves without many distractions. So I was on a late-night shift at Walmart, doing stock in the back aisles. These shifts are usually quiet since there are barely any customers around, and I actually like the silence. It was almost 11 p.m., and I had 2 hours left before I could head home. As I was rearranging boxes on one of the shelves in the pet food aisle, I felt like someone was watching me. I looked around but didn't see anyone, so I brushed it off as just being tired. But a few minutes later, I moved over to the laundry aisle, and there he was, a guy just standing at the end of the aisle, looking straight at me. I figured he probably needed something, so I asked him, "Hey, can I help you find something?" He just looked at me for a second, and then gave me this weird, awkward smile before turning and walking away. Kinda odd, but we get strange folks in here all the time. Anyway, I keep stocking the shelves, but I can't shake this feeling that he's somewhere close by, still watching me. Every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I'd see him at the end of another aisle, just standing there, staring, and then quickly looking away. The store was practically empty, and there were only a couple of other employees around, all busy with their own work. It started to feel like he was intentionally keeping himself in my line of sight. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go back to the employee area near the front, where the cameras were, figuring he wouldn't follow me that far. I put down my stock cart and started walking casually toward the front. But as I walked, I noticed he was following me again, this time moving a little faster. My heart started racing. I quickened my pace, hoping to find one of my coworkers in the break area. Just as I was about to reach the staff-only door, he stepped in front of me, blocking my way. He was standing so close that I could see his pupils, wide and unblinking. "Why are you trying to run?" he asked, tilting his head, his smile gone. "I'm not trying to run. I just have to finish my shift," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please, I need to get through." He hesitated for a second, eyes narrowing, then slowly stepped aside, but not without giving me a look that made my skin crawl. I pushed past him and practically sprinted to the back, where I found my coworker Mike sorting boxes. I told Mike, "Hey, there's this guy out there. He's been following me around all night, and I think he might be dangerous." Mike, a big guy with a calm face, nodded and said he'd come check it out with me. When we walked back to the main aisle, the guy was still there, leaning against a shelf, looking way too comfortable. But as soon as he saw Mike, his whole demeanor changed. He put on a grin and said, "Oh hey, I didn't mean to scare anyone. I was just, looking for some help finding stuff. Sorry if I made you uncomfortable." Mike looked at him, then at me, clearly trying to gauge what was going on. "All right, well let's keep the aisles clear," Mike said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "If you need anything, I'll be right here." The guy nodded, all innocent, and walked down the aisle like nothing happened. Mike stayed with me for a bit, making sure the guy was gone. I finally felt safe, but something about the whole thing still didn't sit right with me. As the shift was ending, I went out to the parking lot with Mike close behind, just in case. We both looked around to make sure the guy wasn't hanging around. I reached my car and waved goodbye to Mike, feeling relieved that it was over. But as I unlocked my car door and got in, I happened to glance at my rearview mirror. And there he was, standing in the shadows at the edge of the lot, watching me again, smiling in that same unsettling way. I froze, unsure of what to do. Then he lifted something in his hand, and I realized it was just his phone. He pointed to it and said, "I just wanted to get your number." I felt a wave of anger and fear wash over me, and I quickly drove off, shaking all over. I didn't see him again that night, but the whole experience left me rattled. The next day, I told some of my coworkers about the guy. That's when one of them, Jenna, casually mentioned, "Oh, you mean the guy who hangs around here sometimes? He's a known crackhead. He's been banned from the store before for causing trouble." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" I asked, barely able to process what I was hearing. "Yeah, he's been in and out of mental hospitals too. Just ignore him if you see him again. He's harmless but really creepy," she said, brushing it off like it was no big deal. I felt a chill run down my spine. Harmless? He had been following me around for hours. I had nearly confronted a guy who wasn't right in the head, and the thought of what could have happened scared me more than I could express. I realized I had barely escaped something dangerous, and it was only a matter of time before he would come back. From that day on, I tried to avoid late-night shifts. The whole experience made me uneasy, and I didn't want to risk running into that guy again. If you have any spooky stories, feel free to email them to the Gmail shown on the screen.